Number 1. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. It was supposed to be just another Tuesday morning. Students filed through the doors of Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, carrying backpacks, laughing with friends, thinking about lunch plans and homework assignments and everything ordinary that teenagers think about on an ordinary school day. Nobody could have known that before the day was over, 12 students and 1 teacher would be dead, 21 more would be injured, and the entire world would never look at a school hallway the same way again. Nobody could have known that 2 boys who walk those same hallways, ate in that same cafeteria, sat in those same classrooms, had been planning this moment for over a year. April 20th, 1999. The date that changed America forever. Eric Harris was 17 years old. Dylan Klebold was 18. To most people who knew them, they were relatively unremarkable teenagers living in an upper-middle-class suburb of Denver, Colorado. Eric was described as charming and articulate, the kind of kid who could hold a conversation and make adults feel comfortable around him. Dylan was quieter, taller, more introverted. They had known each other since middle school, bonding over video games, bowling, and a shared sense of feeling like outsiders in the social hierarchy of Columbine High School. On the surface, they looked like millions of other American teenagers navigating the complicated, often brutal world of high school social life. But beneath that surface, something deeply, catastrophically wrong had been building for years. Eric Harris had been keeping a journal, and what was inside that journal would later shock investigators, psychologists, and the entire nation. This was not the diary of a troubled teenager venting frustration. This was a detailed, methodical, chillingly coherent record of hatred. Eric wrote about his contempt for nearly everyone around him. He wrote about wanting to kill. He fantasized about a massacre that would make history. Investigators and psychologists who later studied Eric Harris extensively would conclude that he displayed the characteristics of a classic psychopath, someone incapable of empathy, someone who viewed other human beings as objects beneath him. He was not reacting to pain. He was acting from a place of cold, calculated superiority complex that had festered into something monstrous. Dylan Klebold was a different psychological profile entirely. Dylan's journals revealed a young man in profound emotional anguish, someone who struggled with depression, loneliness, and a desperate yearning to be loved and understood. Where Eric's writings were outward-facing with rage directed at the world, Dylan's writings turned inward. Dylan wrote about self-loathing. He wrote about suicidal ideation. He wrote about feeling invisible and worthless. In another life, under different circumstances, Dylan Klebold might have been the kind of troubled teenager that a counselor could have reached. But he had found Eric Harris, and Eric Harris had given Dylan's pain a direction and a purpose. Together, the two of them began planning what they called simply the attack. They did not call it the Columbine shooting in their journals because to them, it was going to be something far larger than a school shooting. Eric Harris, in particular, had initially envisioned a bombing so massive it would level the entire school. They spent months acquiring weapons, pipe bombs, propane tank bombs, and ammunition. They worked jobs, saved money, and used the internet, which in 1999 was still relatively new and unmonitored, to acquire materials. They recorded videotapes they called the basement tapes, in which they spoke openly and even enthusiastically about what they planned to do. They said goodbye to their families on camera without their families knowing that is what they were doing. On the morning of April 20th, 1999, Eric and Dylan arrived at Columbine High School carrying duffel bags loaded with propane tank bombs. Their original plan was to place those bombs in the cafeteria, trigger them remotely, and then shoot survivors as they fled the building. They also planned to detonate bombs in their cars, killing first responders who arrived at the scene. Had the bombs worked as intended, investigators later estimated that the death toll could have been in the hundreds. This was not a school shooting in the traditional sense. This was a planned mass casualty event that, by extraordinary and terrible luck, only partially succeeded. The cafeteria bombs failed to detonate. At approximately 11:14 in the morning, the two boys retrieved their weapons from their duffel bags and opened fire in the school's parking lot. They moved toward the building, throwing pipe bombs, firing at students eating lunch outside. Then they entered the school. What followed was approximately 49 minutes of terror that the survivors who lived through it have described as unlike anything imaginable. Eric and Dylan moved through the hallways, the library, the cafeteria, firing at students and teachers. Teacher Dave Sanders, who heroically herded hundreds of students to safety before being shot, died after bleeding out for several hours while students around him tried desperately to keep him alive and help did not come quickly enough. In the library, 12 students were murdered as Eric and Dylan moved between the shelves, taunting students who begged for their lives. The question that the world immediately and obsessively asked was why? Why did they do it? The answer, as investigators and psychologists spent years untangling, was that there was no single answer. The media immediately and incorrectly blamed bullying, claiming Eric and Dylan were social outcasts tormented by their peers into retaliation. This narrative, while emotionally satisfying and easy to understand, was largely inaccurate. Eric and Dylan were not the extreme outcasts they were initially portrayed as. They had friends. They had attended prom weeks before the shooting. The bullying narrative was not entirely fictional. Teenagers can be cruel, and both boys had experienced social difficulties, but it was an oversimplification that grieving parents and a traumatized nation clung to because it offered explanation. The truth was more disturbing. Eric Harris, the dominant partner in the relationship, was not a damaged victim seeking revenge. He was a predator who wanted to kill as many people as possible, and who had found a psychologically vulnerable companion in Dylan Klebold. Dylan's journals suggest he was capable of feeling guilt and remorse and that he genuinely loved his parents. Eric's journals suggest no such conflict. At approximately 12:08 in the afternoon, Eric and Dylan retreated to the library where they had killed most of their victims. They sat down, and they took their own lives. The aftermath of Columbine cannot be overstated. The case triggered a complete reimagining of school safety across the United States. Armed resource officers became standard in schools. Lockdown drills became part of childhood. The term school shooting entered the American vocabulary in a new and permanent way. Law enforcement completely revised their protocols for active shooter situations. The previous practice of securing a perimeter and waiting for SWAT teams was replaced with immediate entry doctrines designed to stop the threat as quickly as possible. Eric's parents, Wayne and Kathy Harris, and Dylan's parents, Tom and Sue Klebold, faced a grief that is almost incomprehensible. The grief of parents who had lost their children while simultaneously coming to terms with what their children had done. Sue Klebold eventually wrote a memoir called A Mother's Reckoning, in which she explored her profound guilt, her confusion, and her desperate desire to understand how she had not seen what was happening inside her own son. Her account is not defensive. It is one of the most painful and honest pieces of writing to emerge from the entire Columbine tragedy. More than 2 decades after the shooting, Columbine High School continues to stand as a landmark of American tragedy. The library where the worst of the killings took place was demolished and rebuilt. The site of the tragedy is still visited by researchers, survivors, and advocates for school safety. Survivors have become activists, some working in mental health, some in gun safety advocacy, some simply trying to rebuild lives that were shattered on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday morning. Columbine changed everything. And the names Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold are burned into the history of American violence in a way that will not fade for generations. Number 2. Kip Kinkle. The story of Kip Kinkle begins not at a school but at home. And that is what makes it different. That is what makes it, in many ways, more disturbing. On the morning of May 20th, 1998, in Springfield, Oregon, a 15-year-old boy named Kipland Philip Kinkle woke up in the house where he had spent his entire life, the house where his parents had raised him, the house full of family photographs and holiday memories and everything that is supposed to mean safety and love. He walked through that house with a rifle and he killed his father, Bill Kinkle, with a single shot to the back of the head as his father sat in the kitchen. He then waited for his mother, Faith Kinkle, to come home from work. When she arrived, he killed her as well. He then drove himself to Thurston High School. The question of who Kip Kinkle was and how he arrived at that morning has occupied researchers, criminologists, and mental health professionals for over 2 decades. Because Kip Kinkle was not, by most accounts, a child who came from a home of neglect or abuse. His parents were beloved educators. His father was a Spanish teacher. His mother taught Spanish at another school. By all external appearances, the Kinkle home was warm, engaged, and loving. Kip's parents were the kind of parents who showed up, who paid attention, who tried. But something was happening inside Kip Kinkle's mind that his parents could see the edges of but could not fully comprehend. Kip had struggled academically from a young age. He had difficulty reading. He was impulsive. He had expressed violent ideation as a younger child, a disturbing fascination with explosives and weapons that his parents had attempted to manage in various ways, including, controversially, purchasing a handgun for their son after he expressed an interest in guns, hoping that supervised access to firearms through legitimate channels would satisfy his interest safely. It was a decision that would haunt everything that followed. By the time Kip was in his early teens, He had been in therapy. He had been prescribed Prozac for depression. He had been suspended from school. He had been arrested the day before the shooting for bringing a stolen handgun to school, an incident that his father, devastated and embarrassed, had bailed him out of. On the night before the murders, according to Kip's own later account, his father told him that he did not know what to do anymore. Those words, whatever their precise emotional context, are reported to have been the trigger. Kip Kinkle later told investigators and mental health professionals about something that made his case uniquely complex in the history of juvenile homicide. He heard voices. Not metaphorical voices. Literal auditory hallucinations that he had reportedly been experiencing for years. Voices that told him he was worthless. Voices that gave him instructions. Voices that told him there was a government microchip implanted in his skull. Mental health professionals who evaluated him extensively after the murders concluded that Kip Kinkle showed significant signs of early-onset paranoid schizophrenia, a condition that had not been diagnosed or properly treated. This does not erase what he did. It does not undo the deaths of 2 students, Ben Walker and Mikhail Nikolauzen, killed when Kip opened fire in the Thurston High School cafeteria on the morning of May 21st. It does not undo the 25 additional students who were wounded, some with life-altering injuries. One of the wounded students, Jacob Riker, tackled Kip Kinkle as he stopped to reload his weapon, an act of extraordinary bravery that almost certainly saved lives. When Kip was restrained and arrested, he reportedly begged police to kill him. He was crying. He told them he had to do it. He told them there was no other choice. These were not the words of Eric Harris. These were the words of a deeply mentally ill teenager who had committed catastrophic acts that cannot be walked back. The legal proceedings around Kip Kinkle became one of the most discussed juvenile justice cases in American history, not because of their outcome but because of the questions they raised. Kip initially pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 111 years in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 15 years old. He would serve his sentence at the Oregon Youth Authority before being transferred to adult prison at age 25. Over the years, Kip's case has repeatedly surfaced in discussions about juvenile sentencing, mental health treatment in the criminal justice system, and the ethics of sentencing mentally ill children to die in prison. His attorneys have argued that his mental illness was severe and undiagnosed, and that with proper treatment he might have been a different person capable of rehabilitation. Oregon courts have repeatedly denied appeals to modify his sentence. Kip Kinkle, at the time of this writing, remains incarcerated. He is in his early 40s. He has by all accounts been a model prisoner who has worked, studied, and genuinely engaged with rehabilitation programs. Whether any of that matters in terms of his sentence is a question that Oregon's justice system has so far answered in one direction only. The Thurston shooting, which occurred less than a year before Columbine, is often forgotten in the long shadow that Columbine casts. But it was a significant moment in its own right, a case that should have prompted deep national conversations about mental health diagnosis in children, about the treatment of juvenile defendants with serious psychiatric illness, and about what society owes both victims and perpetrators when the perpetrator is a mentally ill child. Those conversations happened imperfectly and incompletely. They are still happening today. Number 3. Brenda Spencer. If you have ever heard the song I Don't Like Mondays by the Boomtown Rats, you already know the most chilling detail of this case. Because that song, one of the most haunting pieces of music to come out of the late 1970s, was written in direct response to what a 16-year-old girl said when a journalist called her on the phone and asked her why she had just shot 9 people across the street from her house. "I don't like Mondays," she said. "This livens up the day." Her name was Brenda Ann Spencer, and her story is one of the most disturbing in the history of American juvenile crime. January 29, 1979, was a Monday morning in San Diego, California. Brenda Spencer lived in a small, troubled home directly across the street from Grover Cleveland Elementary School. She was 16 years old, the daughter of a father who was described by neighbors and later by Brenda herself as neglectful at best and abusive at worst. According to Brenda's later accounts, her childhood was a story of poverty, instability, and alleged sexual abuse at the hands of her father. These claims have never been legally verified, but they form part of the deeply contested portrait of who Brenda Spencer was and what drove her to do what she did. For Christmas that year, a few weeks before the shooting, Brenda's father had given her a rifle and ammunition. Brenda had reportedly told people before Christmas that she wanted a radio or a television. What she received instead was a .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle. Whether this was simply a poor choice by a father who did not understand his daughter's needs, or whether it was something more sinister, has been debated for decades. On that Monday morning, Brenda positioned herself in the window of her home with a rifle and began shooting at children and adults arriving at the elementary school across the street. The attack lasted approximately 20 minutes. Principal Burton Ragg was killed when he ran toward the street to help fallen children. Custodian Mike Suchar was killed when he went to help Principal Ragg. 8 children were wounded. A police officer was also wounded. The city barricaded the area. Brenda retreated into her home and a standoff with police began that lasted most of the day. During the standoff, she spoke to journalists by phone. It was during one of these calls that reporter Wallace Berger asked her why she was doing this, and she gave him the answer that would eventually become one of the most infamous quotes in American true crime history. Bob Geldof of the Boomtown Rats read about the case in a newspaper while the band was in Atlanta on tour. He was so struck by Brenda's response, by its casual, almost bored cruelty, by the sheer incomprehensible indifference it expressed toward human life, that he immediately began writing what would become I Don't Like Mondays. The song became one of the defining hits of 1979 and introduced Brenda Spencer's name to a global audience, even if most listeners did not know the real story behind the lyrics. Brenda Spencer eventually surrendered to police that evening. She was charged with 2 counts of murder and assault with a deadly weapon. She pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. She was 16 years old when she committed the crimes and has spent the majority of her life incarcerated. What makes Brenda Spencer's case so haunting, beyond the obvious horror of a child shooting at children, is the question of motive. The answer she gave to the reporter has been analyzed and dissected for over 4 decades. Was it a genuine reflection of her state of mind? Was it a deflection? Was it the response of a traumatized teenager who had no language for what was actually happening inside her? Mental health evaluations conducted at various points in her incarceration have painted a picture of a deeply damaged individual with a history of trauma, substance abuse even before the shooting, and significant psychological difficulties. Brenda Spencer has appeared before the parole board multiple times over the decades. She has offered a variety of explanations for the shooting at different hearings, including claims that she had taken drugs the night before, that she had been abused, that she had not intended to kill anyone. Parole has been denied every time. Critics of the parole denials argue that Brenda Spencer was a profoundly damaged child who committed terrible acts, but who has served an extraordinarily long sentence. Supporters of continued incarceration point to the inconsistency of her accounts and the continuing grief of survivors and victims' families. As of the most recent parole proceedings available in the public record, Brenda Spencer remains in prison. She is in her early 60s. The elementary school across the street from where she grew up still stands. The victims' families, particularly the family of Principal Burton Ragg, have remained present at parole hearings for decades, standing as testimony to the permanent damage done by those 20 minutes on a January Monday in 1979. And the song plays on, haunting and beautiful and unbearable, a piece of pop music carrying inside it the weight of 2 deaths and 8 wounded children and the inexplicable answer of a girl with a gun. Number 4, Lionel Tate. On July 28, 1999, in Pembroke Park, Florida, a 12-year-old boy named Lionel Tate killed a 6-year-old girl named Tiffany Unick. Tiffany was the daughter of a family friend. She had been left in the care of Lionel's mother, Kathleen Grissett Tate, a Florida Highway Patrol trooper, while her mother was upstairs. Lionel and Tiffany were playing together downstairs. Within the space of approximately 5 minutes, Tiffany Unick went from a living, breathing 6-year-old child to a victim of catastrophic injuries including a fractured skull, a lacerated liver, broken bones, and extensive internal trauma that no 6-year-old body could survive. Lionel Tate would claim, and his defense would argue, that the injuries were accidental, the result of wrestling moves the boy had seen watching professional wrestling on television. The prosecution would argue that the injuries were too severe, too extensive, and too inconsistent with accidental play for any other conclusion than deliberate violence. The case of Lionel Tate became one of the most significant and most debated juvenile justice cases in the history of the United States, not primarily because of the crime itself, which was undeniably tragic, but because of what happened next. Lionel Tate was tried as an adult. He was convicted of first-degree murder in January of 2001. He was 13 years old at the time of sentencing. The judge, following mandatory sentencing guidelines, sentenced Lionel Tate to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He became the youngest person in modern American history to receive a life sentence without parole. The sentence triggered immediate and intense national debate. Critics of the sentence argued that trying and sentencing a child of 13 as though he were a fully developed adult was a fundamental miscarriage of justice, that the brain of a 12-year-old is neurologically incapable of the same level of judgment, impulse control, and understanding of consequences as an adult brain, and that locking a child away forever was cruel and unusual punishment regardless of the severity of the crime. Supporters of the sentence argued that Tiffany Unick deserved justice, that the violence of her death demanded accountability, and that the severity of the injuries made any accidental explanation implausible. In 2004, an appeals court overturned Lionel's conviction on the grounds that he had not been given a competency hearing before trial to determine whether he had understood the proceedings against him. He was released and accepted a plea deal of second-degree murder, receiving a sentence of time served plus 10 years of probation. Many who watched the case hoped this would be the end of Lionel Tate's tragic story. It was not. In 2005, Lionel was arrested again, this time for possessing a firearm, violating his probation. He was sent back to prison. In 2008, he was convicted of armed robbery for pointing a pizza delivery driver with a gun and attempting to rob him. He received 30 years in prison for that crime. He has remained incarcerated since then. The story of Lionel Tate is one that resists comfortable narrative. It is not simply the story of a child wrongly destroyed by a system too harsh and too blind to see the person behind the crime. It is not simply the story of a dangerous individual who showed through subsequent behavior that incarceration was warranted. It is both of those stories simultaneously, and the tension between them is exactly why the case continues to appear in discussions about juvenile justice, brain development, mandatory sentencing, and the question of whether America's approach to children who commit serious crimes is fundamentally broken. Tiffany Unick's family has never wavered in their position that she deserved full justice, and that the original sentence was appropriate. The grief of a family who lost a 6-year-old girl is not an abstraction. Neither is the story of a 12-year-old child who, whatever the precise circumstances of that evening, ended up in a system that struggled profoundly with what to do with him. Lionel Tate remains a name that appears regularly in law school curricula and juvenile justice reform discussions. His case is used as an example, sometimes as a cautionary tale about the consequences of trying children as adults, sometimes as an example of why rehabilitation alone is insufficient without genuine behavioral change. What it always is, in every discussion, is a tragedy. A tragedy that began with 2 children on a summer evening in Florida and spiraled outward in ways that touched the entire country's understanding of justice and childhood. Number 5. Eric Smith. There are cases in the history of true crime that become famous not only because of what happened, but because of a single image. A photograph. A face. In the case of Eric Smith, it is the photograph taken at the time of his arrest, a 13-year-old boy with bright red hair, thick glasses, and a face that looked so heartbreakingly young that people who saw it in newspapers across America in the summer of 1993 reportedly felt physically ill at the contradiction between that face and what he had done. On August 2, 1993, in the small town of Savona, New York, a 4-year-old boy named Derek Roby was walking by himself to a local recreation program. It was a walk his parents had let him make before. It was a short distance through a safe, quiet neighborhood. His parents stood on their porch and watched him go, and they never saw him alive again. Eric Smith was 13 years old that summer. He was a child who had struggled throughout his short life. He had been bullied extensively, mocked for his appearance, his thick glasses, his red hair, his slight build. By his own later accounts and by the accounts of those who knew him, Eric had been a target for cruelty from other children for most of his childhood. He had a condition called intermittent explosive disorder, which had been identified but not effectively treated. He had a history of cruelty to animals. On that August morning, Eric was also walking through the neighborhood when he encountered Derek Roby on his way to the recreation program. He lured the 4-year-old into a wooded area. What happened next was a level of violence that even experienced investigators described as shocking. Eric strangled Derek Roby. He then beat him with a rock. He then committed acts of degradation upon the body that investigators have described in clinical terms as sexually motivated, though Eric has consistently denied sexual motivation. Eric Smith was identified as the suspect relatively quickly. When he was arrested, that photograph was taken. The face that looked at the camera was a child's face. It was the face of someone who belonged in a classroom, not a courtroom. And yet what Eric Smith had done to Derek Roby was not childlike in any sense that the word is usually meant. Eric was tried as an adult and convicted of second-degree murder in 1994. He was sentenced to a minimum of 9 years to a maximum of life in prison. He has been eligible for parole on a regular basis since then and has appeared before the New York State Board of Parole numerous times. For many years, the answer was always the same: no. Each parole hearing became its own media event. Derek Roby's parents, Dale and Doris Roby, appeared at virtually every hearing to oppose Eric's release, their presence a testament to the permanence of what was taken from them on that August morning. Their advocacy has been widely covered and their grief has remained raw and present across 3 decades, a reminder that the victims in these cases do not get to move on the way the world sometimes seems to expect them to. Eric Smith's case has been examined extensively through the lens of what creates a juvenile killer. His history of bullying, his untreated psychological conditions, his exposure to a difficult home environment, all of these factors have been cited by various advocates as evidence that the system failed Eric Smith long before Eric Smith failed Derek Roby. The counter-argument, made with equal conviction by others, is that whatever Eric Smith experienced, Derek Roby experienced something incomparably worse, and that the debt to justice cannot be weighed primarily against the perpetrator's suffering. In 2022, the New York State Parole Board granted Eric Smith parole after numerous denials. He had been incarcerated for approximately 28 years. The decision was met with grief and outrage by Derek Roby's family and by many members of the public who had followed the case for decades. It was met with relief by those who had argued for years that Eric Smith had served enough time and had genuinely been rehabilitated. Eric Smith was released. He was 43 years old. He had spent more than half of his life in prison for a crime he committed at 13. Derek Roby remains 4 years old in every photograph, forever on a summer morning in Savona, New York, beginning a walk that he did not finish. Number 6. Joshua Phillips. The case of Joshua Phillips is one that contains within it a particular kind of horror that is different from mass shootings or stranger violence. It is the horror of the ordinary, the horror of the neighborhood, the horror of a boy who committed a terrible act and then lived inside that secret for 8 days, sleeping in his own bedroom with the proof of what he had done hidden less than 2 feet beneath him. Maddie Clifton was 8 years old. She lived in a quiet neighborhood in Jacksonville, Florida, and she was the kind of child that neighbors remembered, bright, friendly, the sort of little girl who knocked on doors and asked if kids could come out to play. On November 3, 1998, Maddie went missing. Her disappearance triggered an immediate search that consumed the neighborhood and then the city and then the state. Volunteers searched parks and waterways. Flyers went up on every street corner. Her parents made anguished television appeals. The community rallied around her family in the way that communities do when a child disappears, which is to say with a kind of collective urgency that feels, in retrospect, like a foreshadowing of grief. Joshua Phillips was 14 years old and lived next door to Maddie's family. He had been seen with her around the time she disappeared. When police conducted the routine canvass of neighbors in the early days of the search, Joshua was interviewed. He said he had not seen Maddie. Nobody pushed further. He was a neighborhood kid, 14 years old, and there was no reason to suspect him of anything. The truth was already in his bedroom. On November 17, 1998, 8 days after Maddie disappeared, Joshua's mother Melissa went into his room and discovered that water was seeping from beneath his waterbed. When she lifted the frame to investigate, she found Maddie Clifton's body. The nature of Maddie's injuries indicated that she had not died quickly. She had been beaten and strangled. What Joshua Phillips told investigators after his arrest was a story that began, he claimed, as an accident. He said that he had been playing with Maddie in his backyard with a baseball bat and had accidentally struck her in the eye. He said she began screaming and he panicked, fearing his father, who was reportedly strict and physically punitive, would hear. He said he brought Maddie inside to silence her and that the situation escalated until she was dead. Prosecutors and investigators disputed the accidental beginning of this account. The extent and nature of Maddie's injuries, including strangulation, were difficult to reconcile with an accident that simply went wrong. But Joshua Phillips has maintained a version of this story across decades and across multiple hearings and interviews. Joshua was tried as an adult and convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 14 years old. The case generated enormous national coverage, partly because of Maddie's age and the particular tragedy of a child found hidden beneath a neighbor's bed after her family had spent 8 days searching for her. The image of those 8 days, of Maddie's parents appearing on television begging for information while their daughter's body was yards away, is one that readers and viewers who followed the case have never been able to shake. Joshua Phillips' case has reappeared in national conversations about juvenile sentencing and parole. He has given interviews from prison in which he has expressed remorse and attempted to explain what happened that day. His mother, who found the body and whose act of checking her son's waterbed brought the nightmare to its close, has also spoken about the experience and its impact on her life. The question of whether Joshua Phillips deserves parole or release has been debated in Florida courts and in the court of public opinion. Maddie Clifton's family has remained steadfast in their opposition. Their daughter was 8 years old. She was the child who knocked on doors and asked if kids could play. She deserved to grow up. In recent years, Joshua Phillips has pursued legal avenues to have his sentence reconsidered in light of evolving Supreme Court jurisprudence on juvenile life sentences. His case has not been resolved in the direction of release. He remains in prison. Number 7. Michael Hernandez. There are crimes that disturb us because of their scale. And then there are crimes that disturb us because of their intimacy. Because of the relationship between perpetrator and victim. Because of the setting. Because of the premeditation. The case of Michael Hernandez falls into the second category, and it falls there so completely that it has been studied by criminologists and criminal psychologists for the specific and chilling elements that set it apart from other juvenile homicides. On January 19, 2004, at Southwood Middle School in Miami, Florida, 14-year-old Michael Hernandez asked his friend and classmate, also 14-year-old Jamie Goff, if he wanted to hang out during lunch break in a bathroom. Jamie said yes. They were friends. There was no reason to say no. In that bathroom, Michael Hernandez attacked Jamie Goff with a folding knife he had brought to school concealed in his backpack. He slashed Jaime's throat. Jamie Goff died in the middle school bathroom, while the rest of the school went about the ordinary business of a January school day. Michael was discovered because of the blood. Another student discovered Jaime's body. Michael Hernandez was found nearby with blood on his clothing. He was arrested at the school. What investigators found when they began examining Michael Hernandez's background is what elevated this case from a terrible and tragic act of juvenile violence to something that researchers and criminologists have returned to repeatedly in discussions about identifying potential perpetrators before they act. Michael had kept a detailed diary. In that diary, he had written extensively about his desire to kill. He had written about killing specific people. He had listed potential victims. He had written about wanting to know what it felt like to take a human life. He had described himself as a sociopath. He had researched serial killers and expressed admiration for them. The diary had not been discovered before Jaime's murder. Michael had successfully hidden this interior world from the adults around him. He was described by teachers as intelligent and by classmates as a normal middle school student. The gap between the persona he presented to the world and what was documented in his diary was profound. The prosecution of Michael Hernandez, who was tried as an adult, was complicated by his age. He was 14 at the time of the murder, and Florida law required the court to consider whether to try him as a juvenile or an adult. The decision was made to try him as an adult. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Subsequent legal developments in Florida and in the United States Supreme Court have addressed the constitutionality of mandatory life without parole for juvenile offenders. In 2016, the Supreme Court ruled in Montgomery v. Louisiana that its earlier decision in Miller v. Alabama, which prohibited mandatory life without parole for juvenile offenders, applied retroactively. This opened the door for resentencing hearings for thousands of juvenile lifers across the country, including Michael Hernandez. Michael Hernandez has been through resentencing proceedings. The outcome of those proceedings, as reflected in available public records, has not resulted in his release. His case continues to sit within the ongoing national conversation about what it means to sentence a teenager to die in prison, and whether the justice system can distinguish between juvenile offenders who pose a permanent threat and those who might, given time and treatment, become something other than what they were at 14. Jamie Goff's family has had to navigate not only the loss of their child but the ongoing legal proceedings that repeatedly bring that loss back into focus in courtrooms and in the news. Their son was 14 years old. He had done nothing more threatening than accept a friend's invitation to spend lunch break together. That is the intimacy of this case. That is what makes it impossible to look away from. Not the scale. Not the body count. The trust. A friend's trust. Used against him in a middle school bathroom on an ordinary January day. Number 8. Alyssa Bustamante. When we think about the profiles of juvenile killers, we tend, perhaps unconsciously, to build certain assumptions. We assume poverty, or chaos, or obvious and visible dysfunction. We assume warning signs that should have been caught. We assume something in the circumstances that explains, if not excuses. The case of Alyssa Bustamante is disturbing in part because it challenges all of those assumptions simultaneously. Alyssa Bustamante was 15 years old and living in St. Martins, Missouri, in October of 2009. By most external measures, she was a typical teenager of the social media era. She had a YouTube channel. She posted videos. She had online friends. She babysat her younger siblings. She appeared in photographs to be a normal teenage girl living a normal teenage life. On October 21st, 2009, Alyssa Bustamante lured her 9-year-old neighbor Elizabeth Alton into the woods near their homes. She had, investigators later determined, pre-dug a grave in those woods. She strangled Elizabeth, slashed her throat, and buried her body in the grave she had prepared. Elizabeth Alton's disappearance triggered the kind of community search that Maddie Clifton's disappearance had triggered in Jacksonville more than a decade earlier. In this case, it took less than 2 days. Investigators located Elizabeth's body relatively quickly and focused their attention on Alyssa Bustamante. What investigators found was stunning. In her journal, Alyssa had written about the murder in terms that were clinical and, in places, expressed something that resembled excitement. She used language that described the experience of killing in ways that suggested she had anticipated it, and found in the reality something that matched or exceeded what she had imagined. The journal entry has been quoted in court documents and has circulated widely in true crime coverage of the case. Mental health evaluations of Alyssa Bustamante painted a complicated picture. She had a documented history of depression. She had previously been hospitalized for mental health reasons. She had expressed suicidal ideation. She came from a family history that included significant instability, including a parent who was incarcerated. The mental health professionals who evaluated her were divided on questions of diagnosis and on questions of the relationship between her psychological state and her capacity for deliberate, planned violence. Alyssa Bustamante initially pleaded not guilty. She later changed her plea to second-degree murder, and in 2012 she was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 35 years. She was sentenced under Missouri's juvenile sentencing guidelines, and the case became part of the broader legal conversation about how states sentence juvenile offenders after the Supreme Court's Miller decision. In 2014, in light of Miller, a court resentenced Alyssa. The ultimate sentence she received was still a lengthy term of incarceration, though the specific mechanics of the resentencing reflected Missouri's attempt to comply with the evolving constitutional landscape on juvenile sentencing. The case of Alyssa Bustamante has attracted particular attention in the true crime community partly because of her age, partly because of the journal entry, and partly because of the photogenic normality of her appearance and online persona, which stood in such stark contrast to what she had done. The 9-year-old Elizabeth Alton had a family that loved her. She had been one of the neighborhood children. She had done nothing to cause what happened to her except be in proximity to someone who had decided, for reasons that even extensive psychological evaluation has not fully explained, to take a life. Elizabeth's mother, Patty Price, has been a consistent and powerful presence in coverage of this case, refusing to allow her daughter to be reduced to a footnote in the story of her killer. Elizabeth Alton was a child, full of potential and personality and future, and the advocacy of her family has kept that truth at the center of a case that true crime audiences can sometimes consume without fully feeling the weight of what was lost. Number 9. Sean Sellers. The case of Sean Sellers begins in the dark. Not metaphorically. Literally. In the rituals of darkness that a teenager from Oklahoma convinced himself were real and powerful and necessary, in the identity he constructed around Satanism and vampire mythology and the alienated teenage subcultures of the mid-1980s, in the bedroom of a boy who had come to believe that he was something other than human, something beyond the ordinary rules of morality and consequence. Sean Sellers was born in 1969. His childhood was marked by instability. His parents divorced when he was young, and he spent years being shuffled between relatives and foster situations. By his own later accounts, he was a deeply lonely child who found belonging nowhere until he found belonging in darkness. By the time he was 15 and 16, Sean Sellers was deeply immersed in what he described as Satanism. He kept a journal he called a Book of Shadows. He performed rituals. He drank blood. He had constructed an entire alternative identity for himself around the idea that he was a vampire, a creature of darkness unbounded by human morality. Whether the actual theological content of his beliefs was genuine Satanism or a teenager's self-constructed mythology built from horror novels and role-playing games is a question that has been debated. But what is not debated is that these beliefs and this identity framework became the context within which Sean Sellers committed murder. In September of 1985, Sean Sellers was 16 years old. He and a friend drove to a convenience store in Oklahoma City. Sean walked in and shot the clerk, Robert Bowers, at point-blank range. He later described this act as a form of ritual killing, a demonstration of his willingness to cross the ultimate boundary. He told investigators and later described in detail that killing Robert Bowers had felt like, in his own words, an incredible rush. In March of 1986, Sean went further. He entered his mother and stepfather's bedroom while they slept and shot both of them dead. His mother was Vonda Bellofato. His stepfather was Lee Bellofato. He was 16 years old. He claimed that his mother and stepfather had been abusive, that his stepfather had specifically been cruel, and that his mother had allowed it. He claimed that a demonic alter ego named Ezurate had taken control of him and committed the murders without his conscious awareness or participation. Sean Sellers was tried as an adult and convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death. He was 16 at the time of the crimes, which at that point in American legal history did not automatically prevent the imposition of the death penalty. What followed was one of the most extensively covered and debated juvenile death penalty cases in American history. Over the years of his imprisonment on death row, Sean Sellers underwent what he and his advocates described as a profound transformation. He became a devout Christian. He disavowed his earlier beliefs entirely. He wrote extensively about his childhood, his psychology, and the path that had led him to violence. He gave interviews and wrote books. He corresponded with young people he hoped to steer away from the kinds of destructive belief systems he had embraced. His transformation attracted significant attention from religious groups, advocates for the abolition of the juvenile death penalty, and researchers studying religious conversion in prison settings. The legal battle over his execution lasted over a decade. His attorneys argued that he should not be executed for crimes committed at 16, that his brain had not been fully developed, that his religious conversion demonstrated capacity for change, and that executing a reformed individual for acts committed by a very different teenager was a unique form of injustice. The courts ultimately did not agree to halt the execution. On February 4, 1999, Sean Sellers was executed by lethal injection in Oklahoma. He was 29 years old. He was the first person in the United States in 40 years to be executed for a crime committed when they were 16. His case became a touchstone in the eventual Supreme Court decision of Roper v. Simmons in 2005, which banned the execution of individuals for crimes committed while under 18. That decision came 6 years after Sean Sellers was already dead. The question of Sean Sellers, who he was at 16 versus who he claimed to be at 29, and what justice required in the space between those two people, does not have a clean answer. The families of Robert Bowers and the Bellofatos had lost real people to real violence, and their grief did not require a theological framework. Sean Sellers had found in Christianity what he had previously found in darkness: a complete identity, a story that explained him, a community that received him. Whether that transformation was genuine, whether it was sufficient, and whether it changed anything about what justice owed the victims, are questions that do not resolve. Number 10. Christine Palilla. The final case in this documentary is one that contains within it a particular kind of story that true crime often circles around but rarely examines with sufficient depth: the story of what grief and loss and addiction can do to a person, and the story of how quickly a human life can turn from tragedy to perpetrator. Christine Palilla grew up in the Clear Lake area of Houston, Texas, a girl who by most accounts had experienced significant early loss. Her father died of a drug overdose when she was young. Her early life was marked by the kind of grief that children are rarely given enough support to process adequately. She had a condition called alopecia, which caused hair loss, a condition that contributed to her feeling different and self-conscious throughout her adolescent years. She wore wigs to school. She had struggled to feel normal and accepted. By the time she reached her teenage years, Christine had found something that temporarily filled the void that grief and insecurity had created. She found Chris Snyder, a boyfriend who would eventually draw her into drug use and into the orbit of a crime that would define the rest of her life. On July 18, 2003, Christine Palilla was 17 years old. She and Chris Snyder drove to a house in the Clear Lake area of Houston where two of Christine's closest friends, Rachel Colorutis and Adelbert Sanchez, were spending time with two other young people, Tiffany Roll and Marcus Priscilla. Rachel Colorutis, in particular, had been one of Christine's genuine friends, someone who had been kind to her during the years when being kind to Christine Palilla required something extra because she was different. What happened inside that house was a quadruple murder. All four young people inside were shot. Rachel Colorutis, Tiffany Roll, Marcus Priscilla, and Adelbert Sanchez were all killed. Christine Palilla and Chris Snyder left them there. The murders remained unsolved for a significant period of time. The case went cold while investigators worked to find the perpetrators of what was one of the most brutal multiple murders in Houston's history. Christine Palilla moved on with her life, continued her relationship with Chris Snyder, descended further into drug use, and eventually married Snyder before the relationship imploded. Chris Snyder died of a drug overdose before he could be brought to trial for his role in the murders. His death should have closed one chapter of the investigation, but it opened another because, in the period leading up to his death, information emerged that pointed investigators directly at Christine Palilla. Christine's arrest in 2006, 3 years after the murders, shocked many people who had known her. She had been a victim of childhood tragedy. She had been a grieving girl trying to find her place. And she had walked into a house containing her own friends and participated in their murders. The investigation revealed a motive that was simultaneously mundane and devastating: money and drugs. The group had reportedly stolen or owed money related to drug dealings. The confrontation that was intended, at least in Christine's later telling, to be about something recoverable had turned into something from which there was no return. Christine Palilla was tried and convicted of capital murder in 2008. She was sentenced to life in prison. She was in her early 20s at the time of her conviction. The case attracted extensive attention in Texas and nationally for several reasons. The fact that Christine had murdered her own friends. The youth of the victims. The nature of the crime, a quadruple murder of teenagers in a suburban Houston home. And the story of Christine herself, a girl who had seemed to be someone the tragedy of her childhood was happening to, who turned out to have become, under the influence of grief and drugs and a destructive relationship, the agent of tragedy rather than simply its subject. Rachel Colarutis' father, Andy Colarutis, became one of the most prominent advocates for justice in this case. His public advocacy and his grief were covered extensively by Houston media. He has spoken about his daughter as a young woman of tremendous warmth and potential whose capacity to see the best in people, the very quality that made her genuinely friendly to a girl with alopecia who was easy to overlook, ultimately could not protect her. Christine Palilla remains in prison. She is in her late 30s. The house where the murders took place no longer stands. The 4 young people who died inside it, Rachel Colarutis, Tiffany Rowell, Marcus Priscilla, and Adelbert Sanchez, were 17 and 18 years old. They had futures that never arrived. These 10 cases, spread across decades and across the geography of the United States, from the suburbs of Denver to the quiet streets of Savona, New York, from the San Diego neighborhood where a 16-year-old girl aimed a rifle at a school to the Houston subdivision where friends were betrayed by someone they had trusted, are not a complete picture of juvenile violence in America. They are 10 moments. 10 terrible crystallizations of something that the country has been trying to understand and prevent for as long as these crimes have been happening. What they share is not a simple profile. They are not all the same kind of person. They did not all come from the same kind of home. They did not all show the same warning signs, or any warning signs visible enough to prompt intervention. Some were mentally ill in ways that were undiagnosed or undertreated. Some showed what researchers now understand to be the markers of psychopathy at a young age. Some were deeply traumatized. Some were under the influence of destructive relationships. Some, perhaps, defy clean explanation entirely. What they also share is the permanence of what they did. The children and adults they killed were not returned to their families. The survivors of mass shootings did not witness what they saw. The parents who lost children and the children who lost parents carried that loss forward into every day of every subsequent year of their lives. America continues to grapple with the questions these cases raise. Questions about mental health, about access to weapons, about how schools identify troubled students, about juvenile justice and the brain science of adolescent decision-making, about what sentencing a child to life in prison means and whether it serves justice or simply perpetuates a cycle of institutionalized suffering. These are not easy questions. They do not have answers that satisfy everyone because they sit at the intersection of competing values, justice and mercy, accountability and rehabilitation, the rights of victims and the neurological reality of adolescent development. What we owe every one of these cases, as an audience, as citizens, as human beings, is the willingness to look at them fully and honestly. Not to consume them as entertainment and move on. Not to reduce the victims to footnotes in the stories of their killers. Not to let the perpetrators exist only as monsters when the truth, far more disturbing, is that they were human, flawed, damaged, in some cases broken, human beings who made choices or were overwhelmed by circumstances or illness or influence in ways that resulted in other human beings dying. The victims deserve to be remembered as the people they were. Principal Burton Ragg running toward danger to help children. Dave Sanders herding students to safety. Derek Roby walking to a summer program on a bright August morning. Maddie Clifton knocking on doors to see who could come out to play. Tiffany Unick, 6 years old, over at a neighbor's house on a summer evening. Elizabeth Alton, 9 years old, following a friend into the woods. Rachel Kolarudis, who had been kind to someone others overlooked. Ben Walker and Mikhail Nikolausen and the 12 students and 1 teacher taken from Columbine High School on the 20th of April, 1999. They were real people. And this has been Midnight Cold Case. If you found this documentary valuable, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts below, and hit the subscribe button to join the Midnight Cold Case community. Your support helps us continue bringing you deeply researched, thoughtfully presented true crime documentaries. We will see you in the next one.